Hello again. What is going on, my N-words? Today I am joined by Nicholas and Adrian, and I once again am Chucky Arla. And today's topic of discussion here on the Curse Discussions podcast is fascism. And by fascism, I don't mean fasci goy type or whatever, the neo-fascism or anything like that. I'm talking about historical fascism, its development and its influence on modern thought, its origin, stuff like that. So, first of all, I think it might be useful to kind of start at the beginning. So, what do you guys think about the origins of fascism? Do you have any particular ideas on this? I know this is somewhat of a controversial historical subject.
Adrian, you want to go for it?
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, the thing about fascism and the reason why it's so dumb that basically everyone on the political spectrum that isn't fascist really likes calling other people fascist, including people like Richard Spencer, very humorously, is because it's such a lightning in the bottle movement that kind of took things from all over the political spectrum and made it into something new, right? You had former communists join, you had leftists of basically all stripes join, you had conservatives join, reactionaries, even liberals to some extent either participated in or sort of switched to fascism, especially in fascist Italy, where a liberal was made the economics minister, and also in Germany, where Helmut Schell was a center-left progressive before he joined the Nazi Party. It is a very interesting, potpourri of different ideas from different traditions.
I mean, that's probably true, but I wonder like how far back you would like push fascism's origin story. Because I mean, in my mind, I guess you could take it back to like Romanticism, or I guess even Enlightenment ideas, like or counter Enlightenment ideas about anti-materialism or sort of the general will or something like that. I mean, I had seen somebody that tried to take it back to Machiavelli, but that seems like kind of retarded to me. I mean, but it does seem like whatever the various strains were, they sort of coalesced like somewhere around the 1890s with all these various influences: Marxism, anarchism, like you said, liberalism to some extent, combining with like futurist or other avant-garde art movements. Even I think we shouldn't totally ignore that social Darwinism or ideas on race and race science following the colonial period played a role in this. But yeah, there were some weird thinkers that eventually sort of coalesced all these ideas, like Sorel, I know we want to talk about. And I think that's probably where it starts, from the 1880s, 1890s onwards.
That is a good point in terms of where exactly we want to start it. I would say that although there were some sort of proto-fascist themes or themes that would later be appropriated into what we would grow to call fascism that existed as far back as the counter-enlightenment, like Romanticism, the rejection of rationalism. Those things kind of brewed under the surface in Europe for a long time. And I think around the 1890s, they really started to coalesce into some sort of thing. And then World War I happened, and then I think that was a very important catalyst for fascist thought to further develop. But as we were talking about with Sorel, yeah, he I think is a really interesting figure in the development of fascism because, so as you guys know, he was a syndicalist thinker in France, and he over time drifted closer to another guy, Marat, who was like, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, but he was a nationalist. Although he was also kind of weird because I think what happened is he started praising Sorel's syndicalism, and then I think Sorel like sent him his book, and then they just began this bromance. There's also another guy who was kind of an interesting figure who joined in with the three, Maurice Barré, whatever. He was kind of interesting because he began his political career kind of as Adrian was alluding to as a not so much a liberal but kind of like a post-liberal socialist leaning Republican. And he stayed as a Republican, but he found himself drifting closer to the monarchists. So he never embraced monarchism, but all his like friends, his like political allies were monarchists, even though he considered himself a Republican. And that's how he came into contact with Marat, who was also a monarchist. Then they both embraced Sorel's syndicalism. I find it kind of interesting too that all of these early fascist thinkers, at least in we're talking about in this very early period of like the 1890s up to the 1910s, pre-World War One, basically, a lot of them seem to have basically been French.
Yeah, it does seem, isn't that weird? Like fascism was so like its basis is almost in France, or a lot of the thinkers are, but it never like really attained as much of prominence there as it did in other places. Another French guy, I don't know if you guys know about, is Gustave Le Bon. Do you know how to pronounce this shit? Anyway, he was like he had this weird theory about like crowd psychology, or like how you can manipulate people as a charismatic leader. I guess he was one of the first guys to like really get involved in that, and I'm pretty sure that was at least somewhat influential as well. So yeah, I don't know why all these weird ass bitches coming out of France.
Yeah, it is interesting. I mean, obviously, as fascism, where it first truly coalesced into what we could actually definitively call like this is fascism, and actually they in fact called it fascism, was in Italy, but that was a bit later.
Yeah, I just wanted to touch on something that Nick said, sort of in passing, when he brought up how Machiavelli was seen as sort of a precursor to fascism,
Hmm.
something like way out there in terms of the timeline that we're talking about. But I think it's not as silly as it might sound, because Machiavelli, for all his good points and his faults, was sort of someone who believed in the a fascist doctrine of the nothing against the state, nothing outside the state, and nothing without the state, I think is the third one.
Nothing without the
Um,
state, kid.
he had like the modernist post-Westphalian conception of a nation state that had a monopoly on the use of force, and that the state should basically do everything in the political realm, and no one else should be involved in that, which back in his day was pretty radical. By the time fascism came around, it wasn't that radical.
Because seemingly by then Machiavelli had already been like appropriated by basically liberals.
Well, I would say Machiavelli was a liberal in the sense that Locke was a liberal, right? Not a radical necessarily, and someone who had ideologies, when taken to their logical conclusion, produced less than liberal results. But after all, he was a Republican, but he very strongly believed that the state should be sovereign,
Was
right?
Machiavelli a materialist? Because I don't know if this is actually true, but it seems to me like there's a certain common impulse in the both of them, like against a certain type of metaphysics, which is basically like a very like action and reality and real life oriented, a dynamic or a futurist. I don't know which word best describes this, but a certain
Yeah,
metaphysics that's very opposed to abstraction. Like Sorel was also very opposed to abstraction.
I think. I mean, this is kind of an interesting question, because at the same time, fascism also includes a lot of people who are very interested in metaphysics,
That's
right?
true, but this is like is something that is we're probably going to hit on a million times in this conversation, which is that like anything you can say about fascism, not literally, but there's like any way you try to taxonomize or categorize it, there's going to be so many exceptions and weird cases. But anyway, go ahead.
I agree to a certain extent, and I think if someone's exposure to Machiavelli was just The Prince, I would definitely understand how you could come off that Machiavelli was just a materialist who only cared about that, you know. But you have to remember, he basically only writing The Prince was literally just like a practical manual, right? He wrote dozens of other works that didn't involve literally just the practical applications of political power.
As we're kind of venturing into not so much the actual political practice of fascism, which obviously, as I'm sure we know, can be very flexible, right? Because fascists don't are not too dogmatic about what kind of economic or political structure they want. But as we're talking about the underlying philosophy of that, I think this is where we start moving from France to Italy, right? I know, so in France we had that important like synthesis between syndicalism and nationalism. Although nationalism and socialism had cooperated in the past in other movements as far back as 1848. The unique thing there was that the syndicalist structure, which I think later evolved into the economic corporatism that we associate with fascism. But anyway, as I was saying, as we start to talk about the philosophy and sort of the aesthetics of fascism, that really is where we get into, as Nick was talking about, the futurist movement. And with regard to fascism's sort of materialism or rejection of certain metaphysical doctrines, I think that that's pretty interesting. And I think we should remember the context here is that fascism sort of came to be in a time when the scientific method was relatively new, in a time when people were starting to become atheists. Atheism was starting to become accepted. I know I'm going to sound like a Dinesh D'Souza-ass nigga here, but like modernism, relativism, stuff like that. And I think fascism really does have that existential thread that Adrian was talking about, where I think it has a certain reaction of if nothing matters, like let's just make something matter, let's just go, let's do shit, right? Like in the Futurist Manifesto, Marionetti says, let's break out of the horrible shell of wisdom and throw ourselves like pride-ripened fruit into the wide, contorted mouth of the wind. Let's give ourselves utterly into the unknown, not in desperation, but only to replenish the deep wells of the absurd. So I think this doctrine is deeply rooted in an underlying idea that all of this sort of rationalist enlightenment kind of stuff is all bullshit anyway. None of it matters. It's just people saying words, words, words. So let's just get out there and do shit. And I guess that would be expressed in a political idea, which would be the synthesis of syndicalism and nationalism.
Yeah,
I mean, that's also like
I
an idea that
totally.
Sorel said basically the exact. Oh, well, he didn't say it quite as poetically, but he was one of these guys who thought that myths, the importance of myth is big in his writing as well. That,
Can you
you
talk
know,
more about that, the myth stuff? Because I don't know a ton about that.
well, I believe he said something along the lines of myths are not a description of things, but are. Hold on one second. Let me pull up the quote. It says, oh yeah, myths are not descriptions of things, but expressions of a determination to act. A myth cannot be refuted, since it is, at bottom, identical with the convictions of a group, being the expression of these convictions in the language of a movement. So, and that's like also sort of relates to why he thought violence was so acceptable, and also why he didn't really like writing all that much. It's not that surprising that his writing is hard to read. He also says somewhere else that verbal communication is much easier than written communication because words act on the feelings in a mysterious way and easily establish a current of sympathy between people. So this idea of like a sort of this sort of contradicts what I said earlier about materialism, I guess, but not really, because in essence he's returning to what it means to be human. Like to be human is to be a myth maker. To be human is to verbalize our myths and to act violently or practically in pursuance of our myths.
That actually is like an interesting thing. Like when we hear materialist, usually we either think about materialism as in the liberal concept of materialism, as in, the stereotype of only counting or caring about dollars and cents, right? Or some rational view of the world, or Marxist materialism, which basically in the same way, just through a different method, you come to a quote unquote rational understanding of the world. But materialism doesn't necessarily imply rationalism. All it implies is that there is only the material world to work with, right? And by that standard, Sorel was definitely, he may be very muddled on his logical reasoning, but he's very clear on how he seeks to change the world, right?
Hmm.
And the importance of that change. So I think you could definitely call him a materialist. So I don't think you're wrong, Nick, calling fascists materialists just because they don't hold to Enlightenment ideas of empiricism.
Another really important element in futurism, particularly, I think, is the notion of almost like I want to call it starting history over or something like that. There's this weird tension between, on the one hand, obviously, fascism, particularly in its political form, fetishized the historical past, a romantic or heroic past for a particular people quite a lot. But then on the other hand, there really is this idea of upending all these traditions in favor of like a mythology that may or may not have ever actually existed or to varying extents. And I think that that's can be interestingly expressed again in Marietti's writings on he for some reason was really against libraries, museums. Like,
Yes, burn the libraries.
yeah, that's what he said.
Burn the book.
He said, "In truth, I tell you that daily visits to museums, libraries, and academies, cemeteries of empty exertion, cavalries of crucified dreams, registries of aborted beginnings, are for artists as damaging as the prolonged supervision by parents of young people." So that's interesting. Because that was what history was to him. It was like words, words, words. It's all bullshit. Let's just figure something out and just do something.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that plays into Sorel's idea of there is something transformative about action, and to him, the only action was violence. If you were not being in conflict with something else to, rule over it, right? Make a domain out of it. You weren't acting, and you were literally lesser
You weren't
than the
mixing your
violent man.
labor.
Right. Yeah, I mean that is an interesting like, we talk, I mean, we're all libertarians here. We know that man acts is the basis for praxeology, right? Or at least one of them. For Sorel, man acts is the basis for his ideology, but he can only act when he's being violent. And that violence is transformative and transcendent. He thought that was the only way. He didn't even like necessarily workers, but he thought the general strike was the way to move society as a whole forward because class warfare was warfare that needed to happen within a society.
Sounds Hegelian to me.
It's very Hegelian, yes. It was only from the people that one could restore the energy that the ruling classes had lost. It's only through class warfare that the traditions, or at least the power that the traditions had, could be taken back from society. Because the fact is that Sorel really hated the bourgeois age. He hated that there was peace in Europe and that people had a peaceful, lazy, prosperous lives.
Yeah, that is a
Um,
really big theme in fascism. This like real deep resentment of bourgeois, like middle class, and also the aristocracy, and at the same time, this deep fear of decadence. I know that around this time, historians, when talking about the Roman Empire, could sort of explain its fall in some ways by stagnating, having nowhere left to go, nothing left to do, so it just sort of became. What's that quote like? Hard men create good times create weak men create hard times. That is a very fascist quote in the sense like fascism was just totally fascinated and totally terrified of civilizational stagnation as a result of just having nothing left to do, as a result of nihilism. And they were worried that this would just lead to aimless hedonism. This would lead to just total civilizational decline. So you need to have an enemy. A people needs to have a raison d'etre. You need to have a mission. And that is sort of this bond that can bring society together. I think one way to describe fascism might be basically being drunk on like camaraderie, drunk on that feeling you get when it's you and a bunch of other guys, facing down another group of guys. That's really thrilling. That's adrenaline. So imagine just wanting the entirety of society to be like that all the time.
So to me, this kind of gets to why fascism is a bit incoherent to begin with, like why there's so much trouble like intellectualizing it and studying it, is that like it really is something similar to that. Like it's getting drunk on a feeling, or it relates very heavily to feelings. It's a very feeling based ideology. Which it's also a very aesthetic based ideology. Like so in studying fascism, like you are in a sense studying like poetry and art a lot of the time. And it's hard to just like rationally deduce that and parse it out. I mean, even a lot of if you're looking to like study like internal politics of or internal like dynamics of fascist movement in Italy, like you're looking at like art criticism a lot of the time, and like you're reading like Mussolini's thoughts on architecture and shit like that, and like that itself is where a political discourse is happening, even if it's sort of at a sublimated or not explicitly stated level. But this also reminds me of I mean, because this is happening within like art communities and like people like this avant-garde side of fascism, which seems to be somewhat in tension with a more conservative traditionalist side of fascism. It makes me wonder, like, it's almost disappointing to me that we don't see these how this would have played out. Like, there's all these like truncated end states of what fascism might have looked like. Like, if Italy had won and if the futurists, had been sort of in conflict with more traditionally minded people, or if the more leftist Marxoid influenced fascists had tried to wrest the movement back their direction
Like
and
Bombaci.
factionalize. Right, exactly. Like Bambachi, exactly. And in fact, this reminds me of. I'll send you guys this video later. It's like a 10-minute documentary about hipster fascists in in Italy. But they have a party, Casa
Oh,
Pound. Do you know what I'm talking about?
yes, I was going to actually talk about this. Casa Pound is very interesting.
It
Yes.
is. So like I have a screen cap here of like the people on their wall in their office who they like idolize or whatever. And there's some names there that would be obvious. But like we got weird names too. We got Bombachi, we got Tolkien. Somehow he gets in there. We got Mishima, Jack Kerouac is in there.
Hmm.
Uh,
Can we talk about who Bombaci is for our audience who might not know?
you might know the most,
So,
Chucky. I'm not sure.
okay. So Bombaci basically was an Italian Marxist who wound up siding with the Axis during the Second World War and was an ardent supporter of Mussolini's government. And to be honest, I'm not exactly sure what his rationale was, considering they were, fighting an actual Marxist state, and he was not a fascist. A lot of fascists were former Marxists who converted. Particularly, that happened in France a lot. In Bombaci's case, he was a Marxist. He believed in historical materialism, the dialectic, all that stuff. But he just thought that Mussolini was the best, was the way to Marxism, was the way to ultimately the withering away of the state and all that stuff. He had a famous quote that said something like, "The true home of the revolution is not in Moscow, but is in Rome," or something like that. So I found that really interesting. He was actually with Mussolini up to the very end when he was killed. It was Mussolini's like girlfriend, Bombaci, and him, and I think it was the three of them were caught together trying to escape and hung upside down.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Yeah, he was one of those three,
That's funny.
or one of the. Yeah. What's also weird to me is like Bombaci apparently earlier on in his career had a problem with what they call or what like I read as the right wing or the conservative wing of the Italian Socialist Party, because the conservative wing wanted to side with like the anti-fascist or like the liberals or the Republicans or whatever, and him, the radical, wanted to side with the fascists. So that's interesting.
Yeah, I mean that makes perfect sense, and
Yeah.
this is a good transition too in terms of talking about the origins of fascism and some misconceptions. This is where we're all gonna get boomer pilled on fascism really being Democrats are the real fascists. But I did want to talk about what you were saying. Obviously, Mussolini himself was a member of the radical faction of the Italian Socialist Party, and he was quite affiliated with anarchism. Actually, his dad was very affiliated with anarchism, particularly illegalism. There was this weird thing, like it almost has some parallels. This is jumping ahead a little bit, but I wanted to say this. It has some kind of weird parallels from the modern alt-right almost, or at least there is a certain faction of the alt-right who are all former anarcho-capitalists, right? But moderate libertarians didn't become alt-right. If they became anything, they maybe became alt-light or something, or most of them probably just stayed libertarian. But there was a substantial like movement within modern libertarianism of just at first completely rejecting the state, being the most radical and saying like, no, we cannot do this, cannot do this, and then like kind of turning that dichotomy on its head and becoming authoritarian statists basically in the tradition of the right. You could almost call Mussolini a left-wing Cantwell of sorts.
Hmm.
Yeah, I think that is something to explore. And I think Ernst Jünger, a big fascist thinker, did speak to that kind of thing, right? Uh, with his idea of the anarch, not an anarchist, but someone who did not think he was in search of someone who could rule him, basically, right? Someone who was an anarchist. Basically, he was rebelling against the rulers of his day, but didn't didn't dogmatically say that rule is bad, just that these people cannot rule me, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you might not think that's a good case necessarily, but I do think like these people, especially during the 2016 campaign, these people who became fascists or national socialists or whatever they would call themselves, they found their man, right? And this is why, to
At
some
least they
extent.
found it for like a few months.
Well, we're right, and this is important. When Trump did not display fascist principles, even in like at all in any sense, and you can listen to this. This is one of the great moments of the alt right was when TRS, the right stuff .biz, the alt right podcast, found out about the attack on Assad with the Tomahawk cruise missiles. I think it was last April, and they blew their lids. And that is something to listen to. That is the rage of the betrayed, because they were anarchs who thought they found their ruler, right? Sort of having to reject him. Like they could not accept uh, that he had done this, right? And you can listen to it. These guys go on 5 minute long rants about it. It's very interesting, like, to listen to it, because they seem to have genuine emotions about it.
Something I wanted to say about that. Now, I agree that these are certainly very interesting historical parallels, right, between the evolution, for example, of a lot of Italian syndicalists, Spanish syndicalists, and anarchists into fascists, and the evolution of contemporary anarcho-capitalists in the Anglosphere into basic alt-right or however they would identify. But I also want to point out, this is an interesting thing, that despite those historical parallels, there isn't really a sense of continuity between modern fascist or so-called fascist, like alt-right, even neo-Nazi, whatever you want to, like all these different little things. None of them quite capture what fascism actually was. I wouldn't really consider any of them fascist because to me it seems like fascism basically was destroyed by physical force. Like it almost ceased to exist as an ideology after the Second World War. I mean, of course, you had some smaller underground movements. I know that you had what was his name? The SS guy who helped the the coup in Greece in the 60s, stuff like that.
Yeah, what was it, Otto Streisinger or something
Otto
like
Scorzeni. But
that? Yeah.
so you had obviously still fascists around, but fascism stopped reproducing itself as a movement. And I think what you saw later on with people like George Lincoln Rockwell, in the modern day, people like Heimbach and the Traditionalist Worker Party, um,
Yeah.
they're not really like fascist in the sense, because like, so take Hitler for example. He's a famous National Socialist, but
He
he
is?
okay, but he wasn't even like
Go
a
on, go
white
on.
nationalist, right? Like that's probably
Yes.
the easiest example to point out. He was a German nationalist, and he had strong feelings about Aryanism. He had like weird racial theories, but though he wasn't really a Aryanism was not he was not a pan-European, right? For example, obviously we know like the famous thing is the Japanese honorary Aryans, whatever. Ryan Falk talked about how he allied with Japan to attack Russia, and that was so bad for pan Europeans, whatever. But there's more to it than that. Obviously, there's the thing that he felt that the peoples of Islam will always be closer to us than, for example, France. Right? I mean, his theory was not that like this sort of hyperborean pan-Europeanism. It was that you had this group a long time ago who lived somewhere in the Caucasus or something.
Well, can I say something? That is Hyperboreanism. I mean, well, and this is
I don't
something
think so.
Ryan. Well, this is something Ryan talked about a little more recently than he talked about the Hitler thing. Um, and this is sort of part of a bigger point. So, Hyperboreanism was, I mean, I've linked you, or maybe just the group, the arguments between Otto Strasser and Adolf Hitler, and one of the arguments was about the emergence of art in, for example, Egypt and China. Strasser thought that said that they were competent civilizations. Hitler said, and I quote, "You have liberal opinions." And he went on to say,
Lib Cucks BTFO.
yeah, literally. He went on to say, the only good art that came from Egypt and China are the result of an Aryan minority in those
Right.
populations.
So that goes into what I was saying, right? So it's this theory that a long time ago you had this group from outside Europe called the Aryans, which sort of corresponds to the Indo-Europeans, although the Nazis took this much further than it actually went.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely way too far.
Top 10 pranks that went
Even
way too
even
far.
cut. Yeah, yeah. the like way further than racial scientists were ever willing to go, even back then, before we mapped the genome. They were like, there's no anthropological proof for this.
Yes.
Like, why is Himmler going to Tibet
Yes.
and claiming that this is the root of like Aryan civilization
But
or
yeah,
whatever?
so the idea that Aryans spread out into every race, and Hitler did think that the most pure Aryans remaining in the earth were in Germany, and that it sort of radiated out from Germany. So like other Germanic peoples were kind of Aryan, certain West Slavs were kind of Aryan, and that those are the ones that he wanted to assimilate into it when he in the General Plan Ost. But this was not white nationalism. This was German nationalism and some fucking
Yes.
weird racial theories. White nationalism as an ideology, I don't think really could originate anywhere, at least in the 20th century, could originate anywhere besides the New World. Because it's really the New World where the identities of European ethnicities are weakened so much that they can get mixed up, and someone who's like Irish, Italian, German, French, English, whatever, all of that just gets mixed together in this fucking El Gablino, who what they just contrast that with Africans, blacks, or Chinese or Amerindian mestizos.
Right. I mean, yeah,
I mean, this
identity.
is like why the you know the 1934 conference of like the fascist international, like that's why that's basically failed, because these people were not white nationalists, really. They were nationalists of whatever country they were from, and they couldn't even they could basically agree on nothing about what fascism should be.
That's actually very interesting. Could you talk more about that? Because I honestly don't know anything about the 1934 fascist conference.
Well, I mean, it had representatives from fascist parties from all over Europe. I think it maybe even had like quasi-fascist people from like South America. I'm not sure about that, but yeah, it essentially failed because the countries were not interested in cooperating with it. They couldn't agree on what was more important, like racial issues or ethnic issues or economic issues. I think Spain just basically said, we don't want anything to do with this at all. We're just a purely nationalist movement, and they never had a
The
second one as far as
phalangist said that.
yeah, which is a little strange, right, considering
Yeah.
interaction between them and Portugal and South America. But I mean, this kind of gets to the question. I mean, Chucky, it sounds like you've been saying this is fascist, this is not fascist. I mean, it seems like you have a relatively concrete conception of what fascism is in your mind. So I mean, like, what is it?
I have no idea. Well, okay. So to me, I think this kind of gets into like a difficult question about how to define fascism because so first of all, one of the most important things about fascism is the fact that it is, for an ideology, unusually divorced from a specific thinker. We've been talking about Sorel, Marat, Marionetti, whatever, but all of those people, they're relatively obscure, right? Like most, like normies who will say this is fascist, none of them even know who any of those people are. But even a lot of people in who were nominally members of fascist movements probably didn't know who those people were, especially later on. Uh, you would have, this is contrasted with, for example, in Vietnam, even like these rural agricultural peasants, they have like at least a loose grasp of who Karl Marx was. They may not understand Marxism, but they would say like, "Oh yeah,
Hmm.
Karl Marx, he's the good thing." But in Europe, like I'm pretty sure some random fucking Hungarian in like the Cross Arrow Party had no idea who fucking, Barre would be. Like they just would not know. And so that is something that's pretty interesting in the sense that fascism, it makes it very hard to define it as an ideology, because if you don't have one person deciding, okay, this is what we believe in, this is what we don't believe in, then it becomes very difficult to set ideological bounds for this is fascism, this isn't fascism. It's almost like the difference between a constructed language like Esperanto versus a natural language like English. But anyway, so this gives rise to a different explanation, which is one that I have sort of wrestled with, and this is the view of Robert Paxton, who's kind of a cuck. He said his argument was that basically fascism should not be viewed as an ideology, and that when one is analyzing fascism, they should essentially pay no attention to like its intellectual stylings, because that was all just like noise, whatever, they were just saying random stuff. What they should pay attention to is the actual tendencies of what fascism did, right? Which is sort of interesting because this gets into the historical materialist angle on it, right? We can talk about fascism as a historical phenomenon of something that happened after the Great Depression in the Western world and after World War One. Both of those two things combined and produced this trauma. And fascism is the expression of increased nationalism, increased authoritarianism, stuff like modernism, all of these trends which are not necessarily ideological but are more just historical. And
Okay, but then we have like a basket of phenomena, right?
yeah.
Like modernist, violent, authoritarian, stuff like that. So we can make a list of things like that. I think this is basically, uh, if I trace it out, if I'm correct about this, basically after World War II, people couldn't even think about fascism properly at all. They just thought it was like evil. Even like academics thought this way. And then by the 70s, they had figured out that they could make a little laundry list of stuff that fascist regimes typically were like or did. And and then I and then from there it kind of petered out or went random directions. Like this dude that you just mentioned had his cuck theory. There was, I mean, to me, what was interesting out of that debate, though, is that we had this idea of what's a fascist minimum. Like, okay, we can come up with a bunch of right-wing authoritarian regimes, but then or ones that were violent or populist, but then we'll realize that many of those don't really seem fascist to us. Yeah. So what is the like minimum criteria that something needs to have? And if it doesn't have that, then it's definitely not fascist.
Well, that's the inherent problem with this sort of definition, right? Is that you're going to catch things in your net that don't seem to you to be fascisty, and you're going to pick up, you're going to miss things that seem to you to be fascisty. And really, honestly, in the post-war world, what I think most people, even a lot of academics, their in conception of fascism is going to be inherently tied to being a racist white male who kind of sympathized with the Axis during World War II, which is a bad way of thinking about it, because even a lot of racist white males who sympathized with the Axis during World War II were not fascists, and there were plenty of fascists who either were not racist, were not white, or did not sympathize with the Axis.
Yes.
Well, I'll tell you this one guy, this one historian, Roger Griffin. I'm pretty sure he's a historian. Anyway, his like minimum criteria that he came up with was that it had to be what he has this like jargony bullshit word for it that I can never pronounce. It's like palingenetic ultranationalism. But what that basically means is that
it's like,
yeah, basically, it's like a form of ultranationalism which is very concerned with national rebirth. That's pretty much the idea, and that like we have the idea that like your country is experiencing a crisis or a decadence, and that there needs to be a phase of violence for a rebirth to occur, and that without this, something cannot be considered fascist. Do you think that that's like plausible, or is this just like something that they're trying to plug the holes?
I think that could be used as sort of a provisional definition, at least of fascism as a sort of, in its political form. But I think that also might pick up a lot of people who were just sort of strung along with fascism. Good examples of that would be in like Hungary, Miklos Horthy, or in Romania. I can't even think of the guy's name, but these were leaders who were just general kind of like authoritarian dictators, or in Portugal, Salazar, right? And they were strung along, and it's not excluding Salazar, they were strung along and sympathetic to Axis, and they had this nationalist stuff, but they didn't really they weren't the same as like Mussolini's Italy or Hitler's Germany. They didn't have that underlying ideological element of fascism. They just had some of its characteristics.
Sure. I mean, but that's why it's a minimum, right? So like it's overly broad, but it's, I think, it's like, okay, if a regime is modernist, then it might be fascist. If it's anti-modernist, well, it could also be fascist. It could.
Yeah.
But I don't think that's the case with this sort of rebirth-oriented nationalism. I think that it'll be a little too broad, but it's the best thing that I've seen somebody come up with, although, yeah, it's intrinsically problematic for the reason you suggested.
One of my favorite examples, this is a little bit of an autistic sidetrack, but I have to, shill for the motherland, of the kind of thing you're talking about, the rebirth-oriented hypernationalism, would be Altri Nahaisarke in Ireland, the Architects of the Resurrection, which is a really fucking badass name. Their political agenda in Ireland was to, like, enlist a massive like conscript army, ally with the Axis, like create national corporatism, invade Northern Ireland, ban speaking English in public to like resurrect to resurrect Gaelic culture, which would have been a massive feat. But anyway, that's just sort of an interesting side note.
Ireland's an interesting example because they had a fascist movement there, but they were a colonized country essentially, or literally. I mean, did that happen a lot? I can't really think of.
Well, that's actually.
Well, the big other example would be Brazil, with the integralists during the interwar period. But of course, they eventually actually Brazil is the biggest, of course, but in Chile there was a large fascist
Yes. What are they called? Nazistas or something.
Nazistas, yes, exactly. And it culminated during the mid 1930s in a crackdown. They attempted a coup by taking over some government buildings, the Nazistas, and the government totally just massacred them, arrested hundreds of Nazistas, and executed them.
Yeah.
Which is
Which was based. Got Leith thrown out of helicopters.
I mean, basically, yeah. I mean, that it is a nice thing to point out. I mean, and by the way, this was the Liberal Party, the National Liberal Party.
Yes. Base
That,
liberal militarism.
yeah, exactly.
Okay, this is something that we kind of skirted over too, and I want to bring the conversation back to this shilling though. So we didn't really get too in depth when we were talking earlier about um, the ideological origins of fascism and its place on the left-right spectrum traditionally. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
and this is something that I have sort of fairly strong opinions about. So my view basically is that fascism is an outgrowth of the same tree that something like Marxism or other leftist ideologies grew out of, and this diverged from both classical liberalism and traditional like reactionary conservatism, like aristocratic type stuff, a little bit farther back around the 19th century. Um, Obviously, we know that the word fascism originally comes from like the Italian fasces, which were like basically labor unions. They were sort of syndicalist labor.
Well, I mean, even further than that, obviously, the fasces are symbols from the Roman Republic,
Yes, so
right?
the labor unions were named after the old, like the literal bundle of wood.
Yes, exactly.
Idea was
It was literally like a collectivist idea, the idea of a
that the
collective, right?
workers cannot be broken when they're bundled together, just like it's hard to break a bundle of sticks.
Right, right. They're one mighty faggot.
Yes, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Um, we can see similar stuff in the Falangist movement in Spain. I know there's a song where they're singing "Fuera, fuera, fuera capital," down with capital, basically. Fuera, fuera, fuera capital. Up with the syndical state. Viva, viva they specifically had attacks on monarchism a lot. In that song, they said, "We don't want idiot kings who don't know how to rule," which is interesting because during the Spanish Civil War, they were allied with the Carlist and the Alfonsoist militias. Although there was a lot of tension there between the sort of aristocratic conservative faction that fought communism and the syndicalist fascist faction that fought communism. I know there was one incident that I'm aware of where like there was a Carlist meeting or something and a Falangist radical like threw a grenade in there and it killed a few people.
Oh my god.
That's hilarious.
Yeah. And
But in general, they were. I mean,
they
so
were
is
allies.
your
Yeah.
position? I'm trying to get a good feel of your position here. Like, what exactly are you saying? Like, because clearly, in a sense, they were. I mean, they were allied, like you say, with monarchists ultimately. Like,
I think basically the way to think about fascism is if you look at its intellectual history, they were basically some kind of weirdo leftists who like drifted and became more comfortable on the right, but they still had some underlying disdain for the core values of the right. A good analogy might be the neoconservative movement, right? Like think about
mm-hmm.
a lot of Trotskyists who kind of became neoconservatives, but there's always been this inherent tension. They're never quite comfortable on the right? Because
They're spiritually leftist.
they're spiritual. They don't get
I think
along really with like the like Ted Cruz type. Like they're like, what are these?
I remember one of the big conservatives back in the day when neoconservatism was in its infancy and the all the neoconservative thinkers, the first wave, had just joined. He sort of analogized it with a whore that had joined the church, right?
Uh-huh.
He said, "Oh yeah, it's all very well that a whore has joined the church, right? We want more of that, but we shouldn't be too enthusiastic about the horror. She can't start the sermon all the time, you know.
There's also more. This is musical evidence because I'm a fan of fascist music, but in the Horst Whistle Lied, obviously, which was the co-national anthem along with Deutschland über alles in Nazi Germany.
Yeah, if you weren't gonna say this, I was. Go
Okay,
on.
yeah. So obviously in the song it talks about comrades who were killed fighting reactionaries. And that is a reference obviously to during the Weimar Republic, the paramilitary street battles where there was obviously the SA, the brown shirts. That was the not the National Socialist faction. There was also a few like conservatard paramilitaries who most of the time they didn't fight, but they also did sometimes fight, especially as the Nazis got into power. They started fighting a bit, and then they banned some conservative parties.
Yes, and just to add something,
Yeah.
they said reaction in the same verse that they were talking about communists, right? So they literally said like yeah, the reactionaries, the monarchists, the center party were as much of an enemy as
So
socialists
explain
and
that,
communists.
fucking atheists.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Well, I mean, I just want to push back on this a little bit because, like, all right, I obviously agree with a lot of what you're saying. Like a lot, perhaps most of the intellectual roots and sort of their way of doing things, they are spiritually leftist and historically very, very closely related to the left. But I mean, fascism is really such an eclectic movement that categorizing it as a leftist ideology or a rightist ideology is, to me, it's just we're going to get into the same definitional problem that we
That's a good point.
kind of avoided
Yeah,
earlier.
it is actually a really good point. And I just want to say, like, the kind of people that fascism appeals to is probably going to be predominantly conservative slash right wing people because of its focus on martialism and because of its focus on like inequality or sort of like how do you say it, like qualified inequality, right? Führerprinzip and other things. The syndicalist way of organizing, where you know we just put someone in charge to do the
The
thing, and they'll.
syndicalist corporatist way of organizing. That would be a funny thing to epically troll anarcho syndicalists, right? Like just start calling them corporatists.
Oh my god, that would actually be.
Because like the fucking like obviously like basic bitch libertarians always talk about it's not capitalism, it's corporatism. Sorry, yeah, syndicalists are they're not they're corporatists.
That would be.
But Nick, your point about fascism being so eclectic and coming from all these different things, I think that what I was saying in regards to fascism being like a left-wing movement, that becomes truer the more early fascism you're talking about,
Yes,
because
absolutely.
what actually happened was fascism in its pragmatism, um, it made all these compromises and it kind of consoled and absorbed like a lot of just general right-wing elements into its ranks and it diluted itself in that way. Like and there was a lot of sort of party state tension as a result of this, and particularly in Italy, where although Mussolini he had the most violent takeover of any fascist country other than during World War II or something. There was just tons and tons of street fighting, but he also did not have that much control over the fascist party. And there was at one point, I believe, where the fascist party like threatened to overthrow him because they were saying he was like being too much of a conservatard, and then he like cocked and like listened to them a bit more.
Yeah, well, Italy's a weird example because I feel like it goes in a pendulum almost. Like they start out kind of more lefty version of fascist, then they have to compromise and become more conservative, and then after they're getting fucked and they have to like make their second country, whatever the hell it was
The
called,
Italian
Republic,
Social
the
Republic.
Italian Social Republic, then they went back the other way. And then now that they're not in power anymore and they don't have to make compromises, the like Italian neo-fascist movements that I see typically seem more in line with like the original iteration of fascism.
Yeah. And this is also true, obviously, for other countries, right? Like you can look at, Germany, right? Like the old Nazi Party was more left wing, but there wasn't really a place for the Strasserites, or even Ernst Röhm, I guess you could say, was kind of left wing too, although he was just sort of a thug. Uh, but those were all impractical elements of the ideology, which someone like Hitler, who was more pragmatic, uh, obviously got rid of in the Night of the Long Knives. So that is an important thing. Fascism, I think, is sort of an inherently pragmatic ideology. We're getting close to running out of time here, but I do want to make another point here, which was earlier on we were talking about how there isn't really continuity between modern like alt-right fascism and neo-fascist whatever and like historical fascism. We talked about how they're not white nationalists. To me, it almost seems like it's kind of like they're using fascism as a symbol of revolt against the
Liberals or
yeah
socialists or the Jews.
yes, exactly. And you know what a good example of that is? I can think of a couple in the Boston Tea Party, right? Like the fucking patriots dressed up as Native Americans, right? Like, why did they do that?
That's a good
I'm
example.
pretty sure the reason that they did that was because like people saw Native Americans as these wild, rebellious, free spirits who hated being like oppressed or whatever. So that's what they're like, oh, we're fucking doing that. But it was sort of this distorted conception, and like a Native American would probably say, oh, what are you guys doing, right? Another example with Native Americans would be have you guys ever seen the music video for America by Rammstein?
Of course.
Yeah, so they dress up as like Native Americans. I think at least this is my gay interpretation of that is they're sort of doing like a modern version where they're like, "Oh, we revolt against the American neoliberal Disney World imperialism, McDonald's."
Listen, my fascism is not a costume, okay?
Yeah, we're a culture, not a costume. Well, no, but and part of that is intimately related to the left's misidentification of what fascism is, right? Because on the left, like they tend to just group fascism together with all other right-wing ideologies, whether it's extreme laissez-faire capitalism. They'd group it with that. They'd also group it together with like religious fundamentalism, although there was overlap in like the Romanian Iron Guard, but whatever. They'd also group it together with just inherent like hierarchy, right? And obviously, this is a big misidentification. Kind of in the same way that there's an inherent tendency in humans, I think, to want to see only one enemy, right? So they combine all of their enemies into this big like atrocidad that's not true. I know that like some people think that anarcho-communists and Marxists are the same thing. They would conflate them. And I think this is kind of similar to what the left does, right? They think that reactionaries and fascists are just the same thing, or libertarians and fascists are the same thing, or at least that all a fascist is a more extreme version of like Ted Cruz, which obviously is just not true. And I think that there's sort of a unique situation with fascism though, because what happened is that since fascism was so violently suppressed following the Second World War, uh, fascists don't have not really been able to speak for themselves in a loud platform for a while, and they haven't been able to say like, no, that's not what we are. And because of that, these neo-fascist movements, which arose sometimes decades later, did not know what fascism was, and they sort of just they bought this like line that like leftists were pushing, like, oh, fascism is just like a more extreme version of Ted Cruz, and they're like, yeah, fuck yeah, I'm a really extreme Ted Cruz who's also racist,
Yeah, I actually have a funny anecdote that just happened to me yesterday about this topic. What happened was I was at my normie friend's house playing this game called Secret Hitler. Not sure if you know about it. It's pretty fun, but part of the game, you have to like basically LARP as a fascist and you have to pass fascist policies. So after he passes one, he says, okay, now all guns are legal. There's my fascist policy. Like, what the fuck?
Yeah.
Okay.
Although I will say that's kind of a conservatard meme. I don't think that's completely true, the Hitler gun control thing.
Okay, well, here's the thing about that. Since I am a big like gun fag, so I've argued about this a lot. And yeah, to like the like alt-right thing is like, oh yeah, well, we can look through this and actually he loosened laws about guns. And that's true to some extent. If you actually look into the laws, Hitler and the Nazi regime loosened gun laws, but it still operated under like it made it easier to get a gun and sort of loosened the regulations on permits and stuff. But the big sort of what do you call it? The catch was the party was now in control of granting permits, right? Like to an American, the idea of gun rights is sort of just, shall issue, right? Like you if there's no outstanding reason why your local policeman wants to prevent you from having a gun, you get a gun, right? But in Europe it's a little different, right? Um it's may issue. It's if there's like even if he's like, maybe this guy shouldn't get a gun, you don't get a gun, even now. And think about it when suddenly the sheriff was a National Socialist and you were a Jew or a communist or a union member or something like that, right? Like, like it's like the centrist opinion. It's like, yeah, sure. Nazis weren't more gun control-y in a sense than the Weimar Republic, which, to be fair, had to deal with a low-level civil war happening, right? There's a reason they were kind of like, we probably should be very selective on who we give gun permits to, even though they didn't really stop there being, violence in the streets, sometimes involving firearms.
Hmm.
But now that there was, peace, the Nazis were like, yeah, if you're good with your local Nazi party official, you can get a gun. Not exactly the same thing as the Second Amendment.
One final point I want to make here is just quickly revisiting the connection between anarchism and fascism. There's a really good article on this blog, Anarch Cranks, about that, or the non-anarchist is what. And it really talks about. This is something I find interesting, or this is sort of my own angle on it, I should specify, but that's a good article on the background. We talked about Mussolini and also um, Bombaci being like the more extreme, like revolutionary insurrectionist wing of the Italian Socialist Party, and also with regard to illegalism, right, which was popular in that faction of the party. I think that there's sort of an interesting continuity between the disdain for like meekly following the law and submitting yourself to participate in the political process via a party or something, and this embrace of, just fucking shooting people, shooting cops or whatever. And there's sort of a continuity there into the fascist disdain for the conservatard principle of rule of law, like more rule of law. We can't.
That's true. Like even in a conservative authoritarian country, in Europe, like it would be largely, in my understanding, like police and courts and this sort of thing that would be like cracking down on the leftists or something. But in a fascist regime, you just the party is doing
Right.
it. The
Exactly.
street mobs are doing it. Yeah.
And that has to do with fascism's tendency to build an organ outside of the traditional organs of the state to execute the people's will or whatever. It's kind of basically what it is it's the continuity of the idea of real niggas do real nigga shit.
Yeah, and talking about the people's will, right? Um, it's sort of Moldbugian, right? Mencius Moldbug's idea. that fascism is sort of a democratic idea,
Yeah.
and that it sort of relies on the people's will. And Peter Hitchens talks about the idea that Hitler really liked plebiscites,
Yeah.
and he
I mean, they
saw
gave him
that
back the
as
Tsar, right?
exactly, and other things like Schleswig Holstein and all kinds of things. Austria. He thought that,
Much to
and
the
well,
malaise of Mussolini and the Austro-fascists and Ludwig von Mises.
well, definitely Ludwig von Mises,
Yes.
and a very someone who really liked democracy and saw it sort of used against him.
But anyway, I want to say we have to basically end the episode now. We've run a little bit over. So, is there any last quick points either of you'd like to make?
Aw.
All right.
No, I'm good.
Okay.
I would like to make this is the difference between fascism and what it considered, other than communism, its main opponent, liberalism. Um, and I think what we've all gotten from this conversation was that fascism was a movement that sought higher values than the society it was living in, right?
Yeah.
And if we're talking about the turn of the century, especially the interwar period, that system was liberalism, right?
Hmm.
And liberalism pretty undoubtedly improved the world materially, right? Like people live longer and better and more fulfilling lives under liberalism. But the problem was there wasn't conflict, right? Like Pax Britannia and the later Pax Americana, people lived in long periods of time without undergoing what fascists saw as transformative violence and strife. And they thought, in the same way that Spengler thought, that the Roman Empire suffered from that, that the European civilization would suffer from this decadence. And what Jeffrey Tucker tries to do, there's a lot of people we know that don't like him, and he's sort of like a punchline, right? He tries to romanticize liberalism in the same way that fascists very successfully romanticize war and strife, and because that's sort of encoded in our genes
Yeah.
to enjoy it. When we see war documentaries or we listen to marches, we get that feeling, and it's only through kind of intellectual pursuits like I pencil, for example, where we relearn what we just learn about sort of the majesty of the free market and all that. Because on its face, the free market isn't sexy, right? The free market and liberalism, it's kind of boring, it's kind of suburban, it's sleepy, right? It's like the Shire in The Lord of the Rings. But war, that's interesting, right? War and strife and conflict. That is why fascism right now, it may not be more successful than liberalism right now, or even libertarianism, radical liberalism, but it's growing so much because it has that romantic allure to it. And I think it's very important to try to counter that, but also to understand it. Like, there's a reason people love that. People love their little LARP with, oh, I'm gonna save the West and all of that, right?
Yes.
And yeah, without that, an understanding of fascism can't really you can't really have an understanding of fascism without the romantic ideals that draw people to it.
All right. Well, we all love our LARPs, and I'm sure we could talk about this for a long time, but unfortunately, we are out of time for today. So, once again, I've been Chucky R. Law. With me today, Nicholas and Adrian. You can write us an email at cursediscussions@gmail.com. Be sure to like us on Facebook, YouTube, rate, comment, subscribe, blah, blah, blah. All right. Anyway, bye.
Bye. I'm a liberal. Bye.